The allegations against Mr. Daybell and Ms. Vallow
confess to this crime.
Everybody saw that video.
Jurors who was lying to get on here to convict him.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. As 2020 comes to an end, we decided to look forward and preview the top 5 biggest trials to look out for in 2021. We're going to start out of Idaho. You know where we're going. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell, the couple who are in jail and awaiting trial on charges related to the grisly discovery of Lori's kids, Joshua and Tylee, their bodies found on Chad's backyard, buried in Chad's backyard. The couple each face conspiracy charges, but Chad also faces additional evidence destruction charges. The judge who's overseeing the case decided that these two will be tried together. Now, Chad and Lori's legal teams are trying to move the trial to another jurisdiction, and Chad's lawyer is actually trying to dismiss his charges. And I want to start right now with Melanie Gibb. Melanie Gibb is a friend, or I should say former friend, of the couple who secretly recorded her conversations with them. Take a look.
You haven't shown me anything.
I don't know why you're being controversial to me, or if you're recording this conversation for the police or whatever. I don't know what your intention is on this phone call.
Well,
but I love you with all my heart, and I have forever, and I will always love you.
I appreciate those words, but if you really love me, you wouldn't have told the police that I had Gigi with me. That's not what a friend does. I mean, that just makes me look weird, and it's not safe for me. That doesn't look good. I mean, you had to think of my welfare if you love me.
I do, and I did exactly what I felt the Lord was instructing me to do. And I appreciate you, and I love you. And I would never do anything to harm you. And you can have all of this confirmed to you by the Lord.
I have. And my conscience is clear. I feel very understanding what's really going on, Lori. And I believe that you have been very deceived by Satan. I believe that he has tricked you. And I don't believe that what you're doing is correct. I just don't. I mean, Tammy dies, and then your husband died, and then he's missing. It just doesn't sound like God's plan to me.
I'm joined today by Law and Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman. Julie, let me get right into it with this defense here. I have to imagine, or do you anticipate a mental health defense at all? There's a strong religious component about why they allegedly did what they did. I mean, I'm curious to see if that's going to play an aspect, because we've kind of heard rumblings of that before.
Again, thanks for having me on, Jesse. And so, yes and no. And I say yes and no because in Idaho, there is no actual insanity defense. It's actually one of the few states that doesn't have it. That doesn't mean that Lori Vallow and her team can't use it in terms of trying to lessen some of the charges, because if there is a mental health disease or defect, that can impact whether or not she had the intent to commit any number of crimes. And so it's clear. I mean, look, from any of us watching this, it seems to many that she has gone off the deep end. Does that mean that her mental health impacted her intent? I don't know. But also keep in mind, if she goes down that route, she's admitting that she did it. She's just trying to give mitigation why she did it.
And there's a lot of weird aspects of this case. That's why I mentioned it. We go back to Melanie Gibb. She says that the Daybells urged her to lie about the whereabouts of JJ, and that's how she got caught up in all this. But really, she felt something weird was going on, why she decided to record them in the first place. Watch.
Now you listen to the tape recording that you recorded. And that was in, what was that, was that December of last year? Is that correct, that tape recording? The 21-minute record with Lori?
Yeah, December 8th.
Okay. You remember the date?
I did.
Okay. Were you prompted by law enforcement to make that phone call?
Nope.
You did that on your own?
Yep.
And the questions you asked were questions that you planned ahead of time to ask Lori about what was going on, correct?
Correct.
And you planned this as a means of trying to gain some information to somehow either clarify things for you, correct?
Partially correct. I had many objectives in that, and that was
Okay.
one of them,
Okay.
to show my innocence.
Okay, and one of the other objectives, and we'll talk about that, is to impress upon the police that you did nothing wrong. Is that correct?
Correct?
And you needed to prove to the police that you were innocent of no wrongdoing. Is that correct?
That wasn't my full objective.
But it was one of the objectives, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I took the liberty of listening to that tape a number of times, and I found something quite interesting, is that Lori Vallow said on the tape that she would not tell anything to Al. When she said she would not tell anything to Al, who's the Al she's talking about?
Her brother.
That would be Alex Cox?
Correct.
And she also talked about not telling you anything as well, correct?
Correct.
And you two were more than close friends. You were almost sisters with Lori Vallow, weren't you?
We were really close.
Well, were you almost sisters? Would you describe it as that close?
Possibly.
Okay. Is there a reason why you're not saying yes?
Well, it's just a big word to say you're sisters with somebody. I haven't known her for very long, so it's only been a few months.
Okay. But you knew her long enough to make that phone call to try to get her to help you clear your name, right?
Partially.
Okay.
Investigators believe Alex Cox played a key role in what happened to these kids, but unfortunately for them, Alex is dead. And that's a whole separate issue, and maybe we'll get into that. But Julie, I want to talk to you about the charges that this couple are facing. It's similar, but different. Remember, Chad is facing additional evidence destruction charges. The bodies were found on his property, and yet at the same time, Lori is being accused of trying to hide all of this. How similar do you think we're going to see the cases against them? Do you think that there's any point where their defense strategies are going to be turning against one another? I know that's crazy to say. People say that that these two are locked in together. Whatever happens to one is going to happen to the other, not going to turn on each other. But when you go to trial, who knows what we can expect? I'm asking you about that, Julie.
Yeah, it's not crazy to say that. And I say that because, already we've seen signs of a separation between the two of them. Already one of the defense attorneys asked for a preliminary hearing. That was Chad Daybell's attorney. The other did not. One, being Chad Daybell's attorney, wants the case is separate. Lori's attorney didn't oppose that. And so why didn't Lori's attorney oppose that? Well, many think the reason is because if they're sitting next to each other, the jury is going to focus on Chad Daybell because all of the bodies are found on Chad Daybell's property. And it seems from people that hear certain things that Chad Daybell seems to be a big, big influence on what Lori does and how Lori acts. And so that makes me think that certainly with regards to Lori Daybell, that you can expect they're going to be opposing strategies, and Lori Daybell's attorney is going to be going after all the witnesses to point the finger at Chad Daybell.
Going back to actually the discovery of the remains of these children, this was FBI agent Stephen Daniels talking a little bit more about that.
There's a story to be told here at this grave, so we want to do the same thing, layer by layer. Noting any significance. The difficulty, I think, for us, for this one, was the way these human remains were found. So it was kind of this, for lack of a better term, it was kind of a mass of dismembered human remains. Burnt, partially burnt. And so we did the best we could. It was kind of hard to recognize. Like, what are we looking at here initially? What is this? Mm-hmm. We know there's tissue here, there's organic matter here, and we just couldn't recognize what we were dealing with. But layer by layer, we ended up just excavating all around this mass of human remains. And we ended up excavating all the way around it. And at the very bottom of this mass, we find this melted green bucket. And then to the bottom, the side of that green bucket, we eventually find a skull. And then to the side of that skull, we find a mandible with some teeth. Those are the significant things that you could finally see and recognize out of this mass. Okay. And so we did the team the best they could to kind of excavate around this and kind of tell that story.
Julie, given the horrific details of this, given how much attention has been brought to this trial, can these two actually receive a fair trial? Can they receive an impartial jury? Or really, should this case be moved somewhere else?
So one of the things that came up recently is that the area where they are having this trial has gotten more publicity than any because the local newspaper writes about Lori and Chad every single day. And one would expect that those local to the community are going to read that paper every single day. Is there any other place in the world that won't know about Lori and Chad? I don't think so. I mean, we talked about this with Harvey Weinstein. There was nowhere he could have gone where there wouldn't be jurors that knew everything about the case. But one does wonder if it might be more appropriate to have it at least in another county where there's not so much focus just on this specific case. And without that, I think it's very difficult for jurors to be objective in terms of kind of ignoring what they've seen and heard outside of the courtroom and focusing only on the evidence that is before them. And that's going to be a tough job for both of the defense attorneys.
Now, we're going to hear these arguments in January when they have an opportunity to say this case should be moved, but we'll see where it goes. It's going to be a trial to follow, definitely. But listen, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to focus on another trial, and this one is probably going to be watched by the entire country. We'll be right back.
Recently, there was a study by the American Journal of Public Health that found black men were killed by the police 3.5 times more than white men. Now, I know it has been said that the police kill more white people, but we have to put this in context. We have to put this in context. Black people in America make up 13% of the population, while white people in America make up 73% of the population. We have to keep these statistics in context. It's important that we look at how black people are profiled by the police. We look at the statistics as it relates when the police kill citizens. Are they armed or are they unarmed? Because if you're going to tell the story correctly and put it in context. Because right now is the time to finally deal with this pandemic once and for all of police brutality and racism and discrimination in our criminal justice system. This is the time. This is a teachable moment for America.
That's Ben Crump speaking on behalf of the family of George Floyd, the Minnesota man who died after a controversial police arrest that was caught on viral video. The 4 former officers are going to be tried together, and that trial is going to be broadcast for the world at large, although the prosecutors are not too happy about that. They want to put some restrictions on that. Derek Chauvin, the man who allegedly pressed his knee on the back of Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes, faces murder and manslaughter charges. His former colleagues Tu Tao, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane themselves are charged and facing aiding and abetting murder and manslaughter charges. And to give you a preview of what that trial is going to look like in 2021, this is what was occurring outside of the courtroom during the preliminary hearing for the defendants.
There are a lot of things our communities need beyond this courtroom to get justice. TCC4J is fighting for CPAC, a civilian police accountability council, to get community control of the police. If we had that, these killer cops would not even be on the force. New recruits would not be trained to kill, maim, and brutalize as a first resort. Bystanders would have been empowered to step in and save Mr. Floyd's life without fear of being killed themselves. TCC4J, along with the rest of the nation and the world, will be watching these court proceedings. George Floyd's murderers and all other violent officers should not escape justice like the many other officers before them. Minneapolis must set a new precedent for our state and country where police are no longer above the law. Justice must be served in this case if we're to have a future where we can exist in our neighborhoods without fear of police brutality. This is not a future we're requesting. This is a future we demand. We know that true justice will not be delivered by this injustice system. It can only be given to us via the power of the people and community control of the police. Indict, convict, send those killer cops to jail.
Julie, over to you. What does it mean for this trial to be broadcast publicly? And do you think the court will ultimately put restrictions in on how it's going to be broadcast? You know, the prosecutors say only put the openings and closings, only have the defendants if they choose to testify, and only show those witnesses who opt in to be ultimately publicly broadcast. I mean, what is this going to look like for us as we watch it, if we watch it?
Yeah, I think we are going to be watching it. And I think that the judge is going to put some restrictions in, particularly in terms of the idea of witnesses that don't want to show their faces, won't have their faces shown. I think the reason we're going to see it publicly is we've spoken about this before. I think the public demands transparency. They demand information and they demand accountability. And we've spoken about this because I think, this is one of the most important cases that we're going to be looking at, not just in 2021, but in the future. And I think it's important for the public to see what the jury sees, not what we hear about in the newspaper, not what we hear some witness saying to some other person that's telling us what happened, but hearing it from the witness's own mouth. Because just like the jury is going to be making their determination, the public will be making a determination, as to what they believe the evidence is. And again, keep in mind, the evidence against each of these defendants is different. And the jury and the public must understand that, because each individual that is on trial is going to need a fair and impartial jury for the justice system to work. The justice system doesn't just work because there's a conviction. It works when each individual also gets a fair and impartial jury.
What we can say is that all the defense are hoping that the cause of death was not attributed to them, because the cause of death is a controversial issue that we are going to learn more about once this trial takes place. Dr. Michael Bodden, a forensic pathologist who we know very well here on Law and Crime, he was retained by George Floyd's family. This was his opinion on the cause of death.
Shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problem that caused or contributed to his death. This is confirmed by information provided to Dr. Wilson and myself from the family. He was in good health. The compressive pressure of the neck and back are not seen at autopsy because the pressure has been released by the time the body comes to the medical examiner's office. It can only be seen, serious compressive pressure on the neck and back can only be seen while the pressure is being applied, or when, as in this instance, it is captured on video. The cause of death, in my opinion, is asphyxia due to compression of the neck, which, as Mr. Crump indicated, can interfere with blood flow and oxygen going to the brain, and compression of the back, which interferes with breathing. When he said, "I can't breathe," unfortunately, many police are under the impression if you can talk, that means you're breathing. That is not true. I am talking and talking and talking and not breathing in front of you. So the concept that a person says, "I can't breathe," like Mr. Garner, like in this instance, means you should take it seriously.
Then you have the defense who say it's really not the officers, but the possible presence of drugs like fentanyl in the system of George Floyd that caused his death. And we'll put that to a side because, Julie, let's say that's not the case. Let's say really you have the officers, it was their actions. You mentioned different strategies. Are we going to see each one of them testify, maybe testify against each other Tao never even touched George Floyd. He did crowd control. Speak to us about maybe are they going to testify and these different strategies?
So that is the million-dollar question. And I think, a couple things need to happen. One is I think they haven't made and they won't make a determination as to whether or not they're testifying until several things happen. One, they see how the case goes in. One or more of the defendants may think, you know what, the video speaks for itself. For example, I didn't touch the body. I didn't touch George Floyd, and therefore I'm safe and I don't need to testify. The second issue is whether or not the judge makes any rulings that would potentially prevent one of the defendants from testifying. For example, let's suppose one of the officer has like a prior misconduct case. That may come in and that may impact their decision to testify.
Sure. And that's going to be interesting to see. Attorney General Keith Ellison is overseeing this case, and he had a lot of strong words for these defendants.
Today's hearing marked another step in what will be a long process toward justice. I think the Floyd family, the community, and the people of the state of Minnesota for their understanding and patience as we make our case and continue to move forward to a trial. At this time, I'm not in a position to answer any questions. Those of you who know me know that I do answer questions. However, today's court proceeding is a motion is to consider motions that have been heard by the court, and therefore I will not comment on them. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Julie, that's just a sampling right there, but we kind of get an idea how it seems almost impossible that you're going to get people that don't know about this case or an impartial jury. What are you going to be looking out for during the jury selection process?
I think one of the biggest things in terms of this case is the judge and how the judge handles this case. Because the judge has control not just of what goes on with the jurors that are in the courtroom, but he also has some control of what goes on outside of the courtroom. If you're going to have a situation where each juror is walking by signs every single day saying you must convict, you are never going to see a fair jury. You're never going to see a fair and impartial trial. However, if the judge makes decisions that protects in some way the jurors from constantly viewing this type of items and things like this, then you'll be in a better position to do that. No one's going to not have heard of this case. The question is whether or not they can put what they heard aside and make a decision based only on the evidence they see in the courtroom.
It's tough being a juror, and I think it's going to be really tough to be a juror in this case. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, you know who we're going to focus on? Another big trial, Robert Durst. We'll be right back.
Or maybe this is the bathroom.
Yeah, that's...
You're right, this is the bathroom. There it is. You're caught. You're right, of course. But you can't imagine. What's in the house? Oh, I want this. Sister. Right. Irish. Listen. I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Kill them all, of course.
Robert Durst, the case that seemed straight out of a movie. They sort of kind of did make a movie of it. Well, we're talking about his trial that began in 2020, was suspended due to the pandemic, and is going to be back full swinging 2021. The real estate heir is on trial for the murder of Susan Berman, who the state alleges he shot to death because he believed she was going to tell law enforcement that he was responsible for the disappearance of his wife, Kathleen Durst, who's been missing since 1982. A very convoluted but interesting case. And here, the judge denied the defense's motion for a mistrial and said, we are going to possibly keep the same jury. They're going to come back a year later, and we're going to continue this thing once again. It's quite an unbelievable story that, as you just saw, was documented in the HBO series The Jinx, where, as you just heard, the defendant allegedly confessed to his crimes. And after his arrest, he decided to speak with the prosecutor, John Lewin. Take a look.
I was gonna ask you.
Anyway,
yeah.
so I'm looking. I'm 72.
Right.
and
Almost.
Almost 72.
Not till April 12th, I think.
April 12th. Excellent memory. Going forward, I told my life expectancy is about 5 years. So there's not much that I could agree with anybody that somebody could offer me, unless they could offer me more life or
right.
something like that. There's just not much I can say. Listen, look at this. I just have no idea how we could reach an agreement on something.
Well, let me ask you this, and again, I'm going to speak hypothetically, so you don't feel like you're.
If there's something that I could do that would be worthwhile for somebody else, and they could do something for me,
okay.
then there'd be a direction. But I don't see much direction.
Well, let me explain kind of where things are at and what I can do potentially. Your situation, where you kind of sit right now, hypothetically, because this is an important thing, and you, in a lot of ways, I think I might get an honest response from you. I want you to assume for a minute, and I'm saying this, so you're not admitting, and I'm telling you, I want you to assume that you had done some of the things, or all the things that I think you did. I want you to assume that you killed Kathy, for instance. And I know you're saying, you're denying that, right? You're saying, I didn't do that, correct?
Correct.
Well, I want you to assume you did do it. If you did do it, at this point in your life, would you have an interest in saying what happened and telling her family? If you had done it, or would you go, no, you know what? No, that's not really something I would care about. I don't really care if they know where she is, what I did with her, if that had happened.
If there was something I could do for her family,
okay,
and it would get me, then it would be worthwhile for me.
Not only did he exceed his 5-year life expectancy, but you want to hear something interesting? His retrial, or the continuation of his trial, is going to continue on his 78th birthday. Wow, April 12th. All right, so here's the thing, Julie. He had a lot to say in this interrogation tape. He's had a lot to say throughout his life. Is he ultimately going to take the stand? Because from where we last left off, he was going to.
So, I mean, it's hard for anyone to imagine him not taking the stand. And I say that because the last time he took the stand, he got almost an acquittal on almost all the charges. And so, in a sense, he may think he's very good at getting over on juries. The difference between then and now is, as you said, he's much older and he is much weaker. And it's a little more difficult this time to get out of some of the web of stories involving every single person that has died along the way that has contact with Robert Durst. And so I think he may find it more difficult this time around to testify and believe that the jury's really going to listen to him.
Julie, of course, you're referring to when he was acquitted of the murder of Morris Black in Texas, another saga of this guy. What a story of him. But really, it all comes down to the defense. And where we last left off, This is where the defense said ultimately happened with Susan Berman and Robert Durst.
Bob Durst did not kill Susan Berman, and he doesn't know who did. He did find her body shortly after someone had shot her in the back of the head. He was coming to visit her for the Christmas holidays, which they had done before. What you're looking at now is a letter that was among Susie Berman's possessions after she died. It was an earlier letter that Bob wrote to Susie. They were very, very close friends. And it talks about how he was unhappy during Thanksgiving and Christmas with his family, who he was still talking to at that time. And remember, this is sometime in the late 90s. And so he said, but this is what I want to do this year for Christmas. I want to get us 2 rooms at La Costa. Or whatever spa you or resort you would like to go to for a couple of days before Christmas to a couple after, 4 days, maybe a week, and I'll meet you there. Understand, this is not a letter that was written right before Susan was murdered. This is several years before. We don't know exactly. It's not dated. But it set up a pattern, a habit, for them to spend the Christmas holidays together. When Bob showed up and found her dead, he panicked. He wrote the anonymous letter so her body would be found, and he ran. He's run away all his life. We'll talk about this.
This is a very convenient defense, but do you think the state has a tough case here? Is it an uphill battle for them?
So it is an uphill battle, yet it's not. And the reason that it's an uphill battle is because I do think that the evidence is limited in terms of some of the aspects of establishing the actual murder. The one thing the state has going for them is that they're able to bring out so much about the other cases that surround this, his original wife, Kathy, the fact that Mars Black died, all these things are coming in. And those things, just similar to the Mollie we talk about in Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, when a jury hears about an individual being involved or potentially being surrounded by so much crime, inevitably they start to say to themselves, how can he be innocent? And that, I think, is going to really help the state in being able to push them over the edge.
And look, at the end of the day, the defense didn't even want this. They wanted a mistrial, but that wasn't granted by the judge. Watch.
We would like, Your Honor, for the court, grant the mistrial so that when the time is appropriate, we can have a new jury that is free from the impact of the pandemic. It is free from any outside influences which the California Supreme Court recognized per se exist in a case especially where there is so much information about Mr. Durst out there. And please, Your Honor, you know, we've been doing this together for a long, long time, and yet every time I work hard to prepare and make a cogent argument as best I can, I get told that I'm doing this for ulterior motives. Your Honor, believe me, David Chesnoff wants to try this case. I'm not trying to do anything here that actually helps me.
Now, Julie, if this jury is in fact brought back a year later, how is that going to look? How are they going to remind the jury about everything that they heard from March 2020?
Well, I mean, there is such a thing as readbacks. I've never heard of readbacks after 9 to 10 months. I think it's incredibly difficult. And I think the defense counsel has a very valid point that the jury hasn't heard things in months and months. And instead, they've heard what's been going on in the news in regards to Robert Durst. So I think it's troubling. I think the one thing the judge would have to do if he chose to bring these jurors back is question each and every one of them to make sure that they still can be fair and impartial jurors. And if one of them can't be, then we're back where we were before with the mistrial.
And just so you're clear, because this is such a unique circumstance, we have about 30 seconds, does this lapse of a year, does it benefit the prosecution or benefit the defense? After all, it's the prosecution's case.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I mean, it's always good to have a second bite at the apple when it comes to cross-examining witnesses. So the defense would have an opportunity to do that again and an opportunity to open again based on what the prosecution had said on their opening. So in a sense, it may benefit the defense in that way.
All right. Well, another case we're going to be watching out for. But when we come back, we're going to take a short break. Two other major cases that might define 2021. We'll be back. One case that has made its way through the headlines was the death of University of Iowa student Mollie Tibbetts, and her alleged murderer, Christian Rivera, will face trial next year in 2021. Authorities believe Rivera saw Tibbetts jogging, chased her, and then stabbed her to death and then disposed of her body in a cornfield. Apparently, Rivera confessed all of this to police, but a judge ruled that some of the statements that he allegedly made cannot be brought into his trial because he was not properly read his Miranda rights at one point. Here's what we do know, though. According to authorities, he led them to Tibbetts' body. Watch.
Deputy Kivy, during the course of the interview, did Mr. Rivera agree to take investigators to Mollie Tibbetts' body?
Yes.
And what happened after that was done? What did you do?
After he agreed?
Yes.
We let him use the restroom. He was handcuffed at that point, and he was placed in my car with it was Mr. Rivera, myself, an FBI agent, and one of the Iowa City police officers who had been interviewing him, Pamela Romero, who acted as our interpreter, and he directed us to her body.
All right, Julie, back to you. What can we expect from this trial?
So, it's interesting because I think a lot of people thought because of the mistakes with the Miranda warnings that there would be limits, a lot of limits to what the jury was going to hear. But the judge made a decision that very little of the case will not come in. The jury will be hearing about many of the defendant's statements. They will be hearing about the fact that the defendant's vehicle was seen close to where the victim was. They'll be hearing about the DNA evidence, the blood of the victim that was found in his vehicle. And they'll also be hearing about the fact that he led them to her body. And so those pieces of evidence are pretty overwhelming in terms of pointing the jury directly at this defendant as the person responsible for her death.
Let's analyze a second his defense, or probable defense, where he claims that he blacked out, doesn't remember attacking her, doesn't remember killing her, and just found her body in his car, got nervous and then disposed of her in the cornfield. This blacked out defense, what do you make of it? What should we be looking out for and how it's presented?
So I don't mean to smirk, but I think it's very convenient when a defendant brutally murders a woman and then suddenly says that he blacked out. I think that's just a way to avoid admitting his responsibility. However, that indicates that there may be something called diminished responsibility, meaning that the defense will take that position saying that because he blacked out, because he doesn't remember, then therefore he couldn't have formed the intent to have murdered this woman. Would that get him off the hook? Absolutely not. But it might lower the charges at the end as to what the jury's final decision is. Keep in mind, though, if he goes that route, he has to admit to killing her in order for that defense to even mean anything in regards to this case.
Well, you know what's interesting is as much as we talk about the legal aspect of it, there is a political nature to it as well. Rivera is an illegal immigrant, and you can imagine whatever the outcome of that trial will be, it is going to be used in the overall larger conversation. But I want to focus now, and we're saving our last case, to probably the most unexpected case of 2021, Scott Peterson, believe it or not. This is the man who was convicted of murdering his wife, Lacey, and their unborn son, Connor, in an explosive and extremely high-profile trial back in 2004. It's a trial that helped to define the true crime era. He was sentenced to death, but a few months ago, the California Supreme Court overturned the sentence, ordered a new trial as to the penalty component, the conviction stand, and said there was issues in how the jury was ultimately selected. That's a big no-no. So I want to start right now with Cliff Gardner. This is Peterson's defense attorney. Take a look.
So let me talk a little bit about why I believe that there's a need to reverse the guilt phase as well. And it's a relatively simple Eighth Amendment argument that depends on two principles. The first is that effective group deliberation is essential to reach a reliable guilt phase verdict. There's not much dispute about that. The second is that in a series of cases, the United States Supreme Court has made clear that the Eighth Amendment does not permit procedures which undercut reliability. Now, before I put these two together, I want to concede something. The defendant is not entitled to a jury of 12 people that are all skeptical about the death penalty and that may harbor a pro-defense bias and may harbor an anti-prosecution bias. But by the same token, neither is the prosecution entitled to a jury of 12 people that think the death penalty is swell and that harbor a pro-prosecution bias and an anti-defense bias. Reliability is best served when both groups are on the jury. Then there's the give and take that leads to a reliable verdict. And what happened here was the systematic exclusion of those jurors who were opposed to the death penalty but could consider death. And that removes a voice, a perspective from jury deliberations that I believe is essential to a reliable result. That's why I believe it's not foreclosed by precedent, and that's why I believe there is a Eighth Amendment violation as to the guilt phase.
Julie, I mean, for Scott Peterson or let anyone to get a second shot at this, a second shot at the penalty phase is absolutely rare and huge. But let's go into your crystal ball. What can you predict would happen at this new trial? I mean, is the jury ultimately going to say life in prison, or are they going to agree with the jury from years ago and say death penalty?
You know, the one thing that has changed is Scott Peterson isn't as well known, and the case isn't as well known as it was back in, I think it was 2004, 2005. And so you may be in a position to get, you know, something you didn't have before, which is some jurors that don't know that much about the case. And that can inure to the benefit of Scott Peterson. There might be less pressure. At the end of the day, though, I don't think it really matters if the decision is death or not. Because where he lives right now, there's pretty much a moratorium on the death penalty. The death penalty was imposed 2005. It's 15 years later. I don't think in any situation he will end up being put to death. So I'm not sure it matters.
The only thing I disagree with you about that is once this trial starts to come back, I think the media focus is going to be absolutely huge, and it may be even more difficult. These jurors will probably learn more about it. They may research it even though they're not supposed to, and I think that's a big issue here because this really is a huge case from so many years ago. Now, you mentioned the death penalty. Okay, let's forget about that. The convictions. Currently they stand, but who thought he was going to get a new trial in the penalty phase? Do you believe his convictions could be overturned and he could get a new trial as to guilt or not guilt?
And yes, it's okay that you disagree with me every once in a while. But yes, I do. I think that it is certainly possible that he will end up not just with a new sentencing, which he already has, but a new trial. Why? Because I think the decision in the sentencing aspect by the court impacts the jury's decision in the trial. And I think the other big issue that came up is that one of the jurors that sat lied about her background, denied being the victim of a crime. And now sat on a trial in which the defendant is accused of killing his wife. And so I think that could be a big issue in allowing Scott Peterson to get a brand new trial.
I mean, it's pretty incredible to think about that happening. I don't think anybody expected this. They thought he was just going to spend the rest of his life in prison, rot away. But, you know, a new chance to see what ultimately happens in that really, really horrible story. Julie, thanks for taking the time again to spend with me for the last hour as we go over the top 2021 trials to look out for. And I'll tell everybody this, whatever you do, we're going to cover it here on Law and Crime. So I expect all of you to watch when we cover it and break it all down. For all of us here at Law and Crime, I'm Jesse Weber. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.